This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The role and the limits of city funding for AutoZone Park, Crosstown, and other projects tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We're joined tonight by a number of folks involved with various projects the city is looking at right now. We'll start with Todd Richardson, co-leader of the Crosstown Development Project. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you.
Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. And Lee Harris from the Memphis City Council. Thanks for being here.
Sure thing.
I will start with you, Lee, and talk about, right now the city is moving through a whole bunch of projects at a relatively quick pace. The city administration, who couldn't be here today, some other folks involved with these various projects couldn't be here in part because of the storm. But from you as the city council, you guys are being asked to look at these projects. You're being asked to look at them pretty quickly. There's a lot of money involved, a lot of creative or complicated financing involved. Let's start with AutoZone Park, which that's been delayed. Where do you stand on that right now? What more do you need to see from the city and the other people involved with AutoZone Park in order for you to make a decision about whether this is a good deal for the city?
Well, I'm trying to keep an open mind on it. I think whether it's a good deal is still an open question. What do we know? We know that the St. Louis Cardinals is going to pay $15 million for the team, and we know the proposal currently is for us to pay $20 million for the stadium. So all told, that's about $35 million for a team and a stadium that cost about $24 million on the face of the matter.
Right.
And so that's an $11 million profit for somebody. And so the question is whether or not that's a fair return on their investment or not. So there's got to be some more details here. We've got to learn some more information. But on the face of the matter, we're paying about $35 million, $15 million from the Cardinals, $20 million for the city for an asset that is at best worth about $24 million. And so we've got to figure out how that deal was negotiated and whether or not at that level it's a good and reasonable price for the city of Memphis.
Philosophically, the numbers are very important, but we'll set those aside a little bit for a second. Cities, states, all around the country fund by ballparks, be it at the minor league level or at the professional level or the top level. We in Memphis have the FedEx Forum. Are you philosophically opposed, and do you feel like there are people on the council who are philosophically opposed to the idea of owning the stadium?
I think that, you raise a good question. The point is that what we're supposed to be doing on the council is make sure that we take decisions in the community benefit. And it is hard on the face of the matter to square purchasing a stadium with a community benefit. It's very hard to see that. In fact, I've been on the council for 2 years, and for much of that time, the council has complained a lot that we need a 5-year strategic plan. Kemp Conrad, of course, has been a huge proponent of a 5-year strategic plan, and the mayor and the council agreed that we're going to do this at some point. And my guess is that if we were to have a 5-year strategic plan and we had it in front of us today, it probably wouldn't include, as part of our vision, stadium ownership. That's my guess, but who's to say? Short of it is, you're right that as a general matter, you don't think of city government as going into the stadium ownership business. Now, the numbers might pencil out and it may work, but that is, that's sort of beside the point. The numbers can pencil out and work
right.
with respect to many assets. We could buy a Wendy's franchise and the numbers could pencil out. That doesn't necessarily mean that it
right.
is within the strategic vision of the city of Memphis. So,
yeah.
That's another question to be answered. And, I think people will take different opinions, but I think the starting point is probably not for most folks.
Yeah. And Bill, help me walk through some of the various funding projects that are on the plate of the city council right now. Crosstown, obviously, and we'll talk to Todd here in a second about where that stands as a $15 million approval. I think there's a technicality left before that's finalized, but the city has basically approved that. They are looking at, we're in the middle of Bass Pro, we're in the middle of Overton Square, we're in the middle of improvements down in Graceland and Whitehaven. And then there's all these other issues kind of out there. There's talk of what are we going to do with the fairgrounds. Mm-hmm. It's not a project so much, but it's a major problem with pensions that the city's has underfunded its pension plan, has the state breathing down its neck. What have I missed in terms of big ticket items? And give me your sense of where the city council's concerns are with all those various needs coming to them.
Well, just on the same day that the council took up the Crosstown project and took up the AutoZone Redbirds deal, they also got a briefing earlier in the morning on the Heritage Trails project, which is the administration's massive plan for redevelopment on several fronts of the area south of FedEx Forum moving into South Memphis. And the city's already applied for a federal grant that is the successor to the Hope 6 funding that the city has had for a number of public housing projects. And that's now in the works in Washington, and the city should know something February or March. So that's also on the table. There was so much on Tuesday's agenda for the council and committee sessions that they really didn't get around to getting a briefing on this huge issue of the city's unfunded pension liability and how to increase funding for it.
Which could be a number in the 60 to 80 million
It
range.
could be, yeah. On this show, the estimates that have been talked about are 60 to 80 million dollars in city spending that could be put toward that.
Right, and there was a moment, and I think I'm quoting from your article, where the city is, and Robert Lipscomb is briefing the council on the Heritage Trail project, and whatever its merits, there's also a box in the corner that has all the AutoZone Park, briefing proposals, and I think it's Harold Collins from the city council who said, what's in the box? Like, let's get to the details because we don't have them. I may be messing that story up, but it seemed to reflect a lot of frustration. And let me turn back to you, Lee. Frustration with a lack of details and maybe that coherent big picture plan. And again, these kind of short deadlines. Back to AutoZone Park, the bondholder of the current bonds on the park has said, look, we got to get this thing done by December 31st or we're going to foreclose and bankrupt and start auctioning off pieces of the park. That's got to be frustrating on some level as someone who's got to weigh all these various projects carefully.
Well, I mean, I try to stay cool and collected, but you're right. There's a little bit of frustration that comes with the deadlines, and most of these deadlines are invented deadlines. I mean, they're somebody else's deadlines, and they're not real, and they certainly don't apply to us trying to make good decisions about how to spend city resources. And so I'm hopeful that all the council members will realize that these aren't our deadlines; these are somebody else's deadlines, and that we've got to take our time to make sure we make a decision in the best interest of the citizens of Memphis, because we've got a fiduciary responsibility, and we can't just punt that fiduciary responsibility and say, well, we would have made a good decision, but we didn't have enough time. That's no excuse.
Right. Let me bring you in, Todd. And we talk about these various projects. You've been a huge advocate. I think you told me before you've spoken, I don't know how many hundreds of times to various groups locally and maybe even nationally about the Crosstown project, which is the big Sears building that people see been vacant for, I don't know, a decade or more. The city approved $15 million this past week. That goes with another, I don't know, 150 to 175, you can tell me, that you all have raised or about to raise. You live in Memphis, so you pay taxes here. You're an assistant professor at the University of Memphis. How do you balance that philosophically? And then we'll talk about the plans for the project. But is this an appropriate investment for the city? And give us your thoughts on that.
Sure, it's a great question. It's one I've thought a lot about given the economic times that we live in. I think the most important thing to recognize is a couple of things. One is the return on the investment. So with 1 million square feet that's been empty for 20 years, that has huge negative impacts on the neighborhood. That's a neighborhood, one of the poorest in our city, been hugely disinvested, and we're now going to, within a couple of years, have 2,500 people there every day. So the 1,000 construction jobs that it creates, the 875 net new jobs to the economy that it creates, $1.5 million a year in annual sales tax, plus just putting people there and the development that's going to catalyze around the building. All those folks are going to need to eat, to get gas, to do their cleaners and all of those kinds of things. And so I think the return on the investment for us asking 9% of the total cost from the city, the return on that investment is going to be huge, and it's going to be quick. The other thing is just the inspiration that the project is. You've got 8 wonderful local organizations who have come together to really make this happen. You've got a local philanthropist who has donated the building and the site so that all profits from the development go back into the building and the surrounding community. I mean, this is a case study for how to do development right in the city. And I hope that it can be an example for what's to come. So I think the return on investment, both from an economic standpoint, but also just from a social good standpoint, is well worth the 15 million investment.
And I want to come back to some of the details, some of the partners and so on, but you've been talking about this with potential investors, with city council folks for a year, 2 years now?
Easy.
And so is that different for you? And I don't know how you voted this week, so if you may have voted against the project, I don't know.
I wouldn't vote against this one.
Not against this one. Okay, so why?
Well, I mean, I think this project, I think Todd has spoken to it, and I think he's done a good job. I mean, I think this project is transformative, and it's transformative to those neighborhoods. I mean, this project is, I think the location of this project right in the core of the city of Memphis is just a real psychological boost for the whole city and for this whole region. I mean, this project sits as a gateway to North Memphis, a gateway to Midtown, a gateway to downtown. And before, it was a signal that Memphis was not going to make progress. Before, it was the largest symbol of blight in the city of Memphis. It was 1 million square feet, and it was dilapidated and deteriorating even faster. And so we've shown that we can do something about that and that we can come together. And the partnership that's been created here is remarkable and never before seen. You've got private parties with great reputations like the Cates Foundation and the Cates and so forth. You've got the public officials, city council and the mayor who's been supportive. And you've got the community involved. I mean, we saw the presentation at the city council, and they talked about how it would impact Klondike and Smoky City, inner city neighborhoods that I represent. And so anytime you can bring public officials, private partners, and the community involved all unanimously in approval of a project like this, $1 million square feet, I tell you, you really got to do it. I mean, you compare this to the last large-scale community project we did, which was FedEx Forum, which is a $250 million project. Well, taxpayers paid all of that. Yeah. And this is a $175 million project.
County, state.
Yeah, this is a $175 million project at least. And the city is only putting in, or city and federal resources are only come to about $15 million. So it's remarkable. It's a no-brainer in my view.
Okay, Bill.
And in fact, the council was so familiar with the goals of the project that when this got to committee this past Tuesday, I think the council members were kind of anxious and were kind of saying, all right, we know that, tell us about the 15 million and where it comes from, which was kind of the administration's piece on this. And overlooked in that was something that I had heard that I think you had talked about before, but which I heard more detail about, and that was kind of the plans for Jackson Avenue, and more of a business corridor there than we've seen before. And Jackson, for those who are unfamiliar with the area, is basically the north of the Crosstown building.
Right. It's the northern boundary of the Crosstown neighborhood, and where Klondike and Smoky City is located. Even the Klondike CDC, Quincy Morris, calls Crosstown the gateway to North Memphis, and I think that that's exactly right. It's also the exit off of 240 onto Jackson to get to the Sears building. That's going to be used a lot more, and so the increased traffic along Jackson is going to be impacted once this building is up and running. And so we've been working with Director Lipscomb and his staff, who've done, I should pause and just simply say thank you to Councilman Harris and all of the City Council and the Mayor and Director Lipscomb and his staff. They've been working hundreds of hours over the last, particularly Director Lipscomb and his staff, in making this happen. So, they've been thinking about the communities to the north and what needs to happen now in order to take advantage of all of the purchasing power and traffic that's going to be coming to this building every day.
Mm-hmm. Lee, from a council member's perspective, two very different projects. Some similarities, though. The difference between the city buying a ballpark and the city investing in the Crosstown project.
Well, there's a whole lot of difference in my view. For one thing, this is a private-public partnership, and so you actually see some leverage. So the city puts in $15 million, and we get leverage of $160 million at least of private investment and so forth with respect to this project. So that's a huge difference. The other huge difference is the Crosstown project is a project that the community wants. And there's community support for it. And so at the end of the day, Wanda Halbert says it well. It's those folks out there, the voters are my boss. And the voters want something done with Crosstown almost unanimously. In fact, I don't think I've ever met a voter in this neighborhood that did not want the Crosstown project done. And so some folks can carp and so forth, but the people who live in North Memphis and Midtown and downtown, many of whom I represent, they want this project done, and they want it done as soon as possible. And my only regret with this project is that we waited until December to greenlight it. I wish we would have voted on it many months ago because Todd and his other colleagues have been working so hard to make sure they introduce the project and make sure every detail is out there and in the public space and that we know everything about the project. So, so that's also a third difference is that, all the I's are dotted on this project and all the T's crossed. I don't think there's not I don't want to speak for Todd, but I don't think there's not a council member who's not been invited to a presentation with respect to Crosstown. And I've received at least 3 or 4 presentations for Crosstown. And the last one I turned down because I had too much information. I said, I know everything I need to know about it. It's a remarkable project, right? So there are lots of differences. There's lots of differences.
And Todd, with the $15 million, which will be secured when the council approves the minutes of this past meeting, your other investors are now signing on the dotted line, even though they've been committed to it as well. So what happens next, and what specifically does this $15 million go for?
Okay, good. So yes, we have, McLean Wilson, my counterpart, calls it, we're all running a race, and there's 8 to 10 people in the race, and we're just looking over our shoulders, making sure that everybody's moving at the same pace toward the finish line. And so we have banks, we have tax credit consultants, we have a number of these folks who've just kind of been waiting. And so the city investment was the last big piece for them to say, okay, we can now justify starting work and structuring the deal and the development, all of those things to be able to start construction in the spring. So we now have enough momentum. The uncertainties are less, right, so that people can actually invest their own time and energy and money in closing the project. In terms of what's happening right now, we'll finish construction documents 100% by this Friday. Grinder Tabor Grinder and All World Project Management, Grinder is our contractor. We're working with Michael Hooks Jr. and All World in terms of our minority and women-owned businesses to be involved and have that representation. Those construction documents will hit the streets in the next couple of weeks. And that bidding process that will start will take about a couple of months due to the holidays and those kinds of things. So we'll have the pricing and everything done by early February so that we can move towards financial closing.
And you talk about the partners for a second, the founding partners, the folks who have committed on some level to be tenants, because, and this is partly my fault, and the media's fault. When this project first came along, there was a lot of focus on the arts element, and that was the first thing that got off ground, Crosstown Arts, and just to kind of, there's some exhibition space and so on. And I think to some degree the media, and you and I have talked about this before, presented this as this kind of hippie commune in the Sears Tower. And so there was a certain amount of skepticism, like how are you going to have a bunch of artists pay for this million square feet and $180 million project? It has evolved, there's a big arts component, but when you talk about the founding partners, it's a whole different, gives it a whole different look and feel. Definitely. So name them if you can.
Well, first of all, it's all your fault.
It is, it definitely is.
Let me go
hear
back
that all the time.
I heard you, sorry, I didn't answer your question about what the money's going for, and if you don't mind, I'll answer that real quick. All infrastructure needs, so think sewer, blight abatement, blight removal and abatement and things like that. So it all goes towards preparing the site for us to be able to do the work that we need to do.
And to the partners.
And to the partners. So we have 8 founding partners in arts, education, and healthcare. So Crosstown Arts, the first ones to come on board were Crosstown Arts, Gestalt Community Schools, who's going to start and operate a high school, Crosstown School for Arts and Sciences, and Memphis Teacher Residency Program. And then Church Health Center, of course, came on board, and then Rhodes College and Methodist Healthcare, as well as St. Jude and Alzac St. Jude, the funding arm of St. Jude. So those are the 8 in arts, education, and healthcare. And now we've got 4 others who are committed, Southern College of Optometry, Christian Brothers University, Goodwill Excel Center, which is going to be a charter high school for adults, for folks who've dropped out of high school. And then the 4th is VO2 Networks, an IT company that's going to be moving their headquarters there.
Okay. And Lee, we talk about the strengths of this project you did, and the presentation and the time and the education that you and other city council members could go through. Why do you think that hasn't happened with AutoZone Park? Because the park has been, the financing of the park and the Redbirds has been problematic for some years now. There's been talk of coming to the city to buy the park for quite a while. There are some very philanthropic people involved with it. John Pontius, who represents Pitco and Pitt Hyde, and clearly, one of the the more philanthropic families in town. Ray Pullman, who couldn't be here today, was going to be, but couldn't because of scheduling issues, from AutoZone, and he's been involved in all kinds of efforts in the community. What is your guess, if nothing else, of why there wasn't a more time given and a more coherent presentation that would give you guys, that was more along the lines of what you're describing you got from Crosstown?
So I would be guessing, and I should also say, St. Louis Cardinals are also involved, and St.
Right.
Louis Cardinals seem to be a pretty honorable outfit. I've met with the general manager and so
Right.
forth, and then certainly the Hydes and so forth are very honorable people and contribute a lot to the city of Memphis. It's just the question is why this happened like this? Why did they, put a stake on a garbage can pail? I don't know. The New Yorkers involved, and I don't know the New Yorkers, and I don't know the
bond
culture.
holders, the Wall Street bond holders.
Yeah, the ones
Right.
that ultimately, even though they may not be title holders right now, but they ultimately own the team. The question is whether or not their culture is different. And I think that from what I've heard is that they've got things that are going on that are different from the city
Right.
of Memphis. They've got bonuses to pay at the end of the year, for example. And so that kind of
More of a Wall
interest,
Street-
a Wall Street mentality, a
Bottom
Wall
line
Street
mentality.
culture.
Right.
It's probably a big contrast from the kind of mentality we see when you have locals
Right.
who are involved, the Cates over here, or the Hydes and so forth, Pontius and so forth, or St. Louis Cardinals, even regional players involved in the city of Memphis. I think that there's just a different way of doing things. Probably, it's just a guess.
Wait, do you want to venture a guess at that, Bill? Because you've watched this thing. I mean, we've written about it. I mean, why did it all come out publicly in a not a particularly coherent presentation, without a lot of answers, and with this really short deadline?
I think part of it is it's the nature of this particular financing deal. As Lee said, this is a Wall Street mentality that we're dealing with to some degree to get this done by a certain deadline, and a lot of times the players don't move until you're right up on the particular deadline. The problem with that is the government just doesn't operate like that. Government, especially with a 13-member elected body, needs more clearance, needs more time going into it, and needs more detail about it, because you're not dealing with people who work in these kind of high finance matters every day, especially when they've got a $15 million piece of Crosstown on the agenda, a $60 to $80 million piece of unfunded pension liability on the agenda, and they meet twice every month.
Right.
You have to have more lead time for this.
Right.
Go ahead. I should also say, this cultural clash plays out in so many ways, because the presentation we saw mostly was about the financing of it,
right.
Which is very important. That was in the forefront and extremely important. But the community benefit part of it was an afterthought. I mean, I don't think I've seen any kind of real coherent, persuasive presentation of community benefit. Now, some of the documents talk about an inner-city baseball program. But again, we haven't had a very coherent presentation about that inner-city baseball program, how much the New Yorkers are going to put in. I suspect not a lot, but how much the New Yorkers may be willing to put into the inner-city baseball program to actually create some sort of community benefit from this whole project. Because without community benefit, I mean, that's what council members are thinking about. I'm not an expert on finance.
Right. But
I'm an expert on what my community needs, and that's what I want to hear about.
And whenever there are sort of stadium proposals, I remember back with FedEx when FedEx Forum and the Grizzlies were first proposed, and you've seen follow-up numbers, whatever you think of them, of return on investment. And Todd mentioned that with Crosstown, of all those people who come down to downtown and go to a baseball game, and they come out and they go to a restaurant or they go to a bar, or they buy a certain amount. You haven't gotten those kind of return on investment numbers? I mean,
we've heard return on investment and so forth, but that's those numbers are are moving targets. I hear them all the time. They're moving targets.
Just a couple minutes left, and I want to talk about the financing. And sometimes when we talk about financing and the $15 million, the media makes it sound like, okay, there's out of the tax pool, the city of Memphis, Mayor Wharton, writes a check for $15 million and gives it to Crosstown. And just to go through the complexity of the funding side on Crosstown, and I'm just going to skim from Bill's article. The largest block, $6 million in qualified energy conservation bonds, $4 million in federal Section 108 bonds from economic housing and rehab loans, federal grants under the EPA's Brownfield program for another $2 million. Another $1.5 million would come from City Public Works street budget, and $950,000 from the city stormwater fund fee. I think there's another $500,000 from MLGW. So there's a huge amount, and maybe I turn to you, Bill, of complexity just in the financing that has to be presented and vetted and understood. And some people have criticisms of Director Lipscomb for being maybe too secretive, but I don't think anyone would ever say that he isn't able to pull together a lot of different funding sources, a lot of creative funding to make these kind of projects happen.
Yeah, and that was actually part of the problem here too, because some of these pieces didn't come into play until the last minute.
On AutoZone.
Yeah.
On AutoZone Park.
The city was looking at some different scenarios, and some of them didn't pan out with bond counsel on this, so they had some backup plans for some other pieces. And even if the AutoZone ballpark deal is done, the city for the next 2 months is probably going to be looking at ways to shift some of the sources of funding to something that they feel is more secure. So even if the council approves the ballpark deal, there still might be some changes in funding, and if there are going to be some council members who are going to say, wait a minute, that's not the deal we voted on.
The funding for the ballpark, I don't know if I should look at you, Lee, is coming from Center City Finance. Is that it's bonds?
Yeah, no, I mean, the description of these things is complex, but the reality is we're going to borrow $25 million. And we're going to try to pay it off. And that has consequence. I mean, that's real money. No matter how you look at it, that's real money. And at the very least, that's going to reduce our borrowing capacity as a city.
For other projects that might come up.
Now, these bonds might be a little bit different in the sense that we've got dedicated revenue sources from the rent and so forth. But at the end of the day, we're going to borrow $25 million, and you still have to evaluate whether or not that's a good idea.
And you actually questioned whether or not it would be better for the city to take that money out of its reserves.
Yeah, they didn't have an answer for that. I mean, I think there is an answer out there for that, but they didn't have an answer for that. Why we would put something on the charge account, which is what we're doing, we're borrowing, and there's going to be an interest rate, although a low one because we're a municipality, but there's still an interest rate. And the question is, why would we borrow money, $25 million, when we could just take it out of our savings account and pay no interest rate, and then pay ourselves back from the dedicated funding source.
And that gets back to that idea of a comprehensive plan, because maybe where do those reserves go and so on. All right, that's all the time we have. Councilman Lee Harris, Todd Richardson, Bill Dries, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.